Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Katalyze. Today I have Mike Burton with me. He has had a super distinguished career in biopharma, especially in drug development. Mike, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Could you start by sharing a bit of your background and how it has shaped your macro perspective on the industry's evolution?
Yeah, sure. So, though I know I look like I'm 16, I've been doing this for a long time. I spent about 15 years in operational roles for life sciences, pharma, CRO space, all the way at the sort of lowest level, working myself all the way up into managerial and director type roles. And so, really, really appreciate the world and sort of what's really going on there. But then for the last, let's say, dozen years or so, I've worked for software companies, 9 of which was working for Veeva, that I'm sure is pretty well known to most folks at this point, around clinical quality and regulatory industry-focused software solutions. And then for the last 3 years, I've worked for a health tech startup. So I think that I have a really good perspective on sort of where we were back in the 90s, transitioning all the way through the internet age, let's say the initial internet-based technologies, seeing the sort of real big push to the cloud in the early 2010s, and then now sort of, getting into even cooler and crazier stuff that I'm sure we're going to touch on here in a little bit. And so, I'm not going to classify myself as sort of a manufacturing guy, but I would classify myself as an industry guy that has seen a lot, paid attention to a lot. And maybe more importantly, in the last decade or so, is just talking to tons and tons and tons of customers, big pharma, little biotechs, et cetera. So I think I bring that perspective to the table here.
Yeah, and a lot has changed over the years since you've been in the industry, right? And even most recently, I can't even imagine. I mean, can you just talk through just the increasingly complex and expense that's come with the biopharma industry and how companies are just struggling to keep up with everything?
Yeah, I mean, I can remember, back in the 90s, it was literally just stamping out pills. And so you come up with a pretty, interesting compound. And from a manufacturing perspective, it was pretty straightforward. I'm not diminishing the work that was done. It was, wasn't difficult or complicated at the time, but it's pretty straightforward. And so you were stamping out pills and putting them in a bottle and shipping them out. And then, somewhere in the last, 20 years or so, we started getting into biologics and more complicated vaccines. But to be quite frank, we really got into much more complicated disease states that required much more complicated compounds to manufacture. And so now you've got to create manufacturing plants that cost billions, and can run all day long and maybe even still only produce a liter at the end of the day. And so just that inflection somewhere in the middle there, I can't pinpoint exactly, but just made things just so darn complicated. And on top of that, the pressures of trying to do things globally and trying to do things at a profit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when manufacturing complexity started getting crazy for a million different reasons, the tech didn't sort of keep up with it. And so, or it just was never a good time. I guess, if you think about, say, clinical trials or regulatory that have probably enjoyed a lot more technology innovation, there were opportunities to inject new technologies, whereas with manufacturing, it's just a wheel. It's just got to keep turning. You could never sort of turn it off. And so as a result, then, you only have a couple of very focused software applications that get developed for that space. And as things get more complex, those older systems, as we know, if we think about, systems we used or phones that we used 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, that's just not going to keep up with the world the way it stands now today. And so now you've got sort of legacy applications that you're being forced to use. The old joke used to be that, like, at home we had the best stuff, and then you go to work and you'd be tortured with all these bad, ugly technologies. Why can't we have all the best stuff at work too? That definitely has changed. There is definitely a lot more, but with manufacturing specifically, you've seen a lot of like mergers and acquisitions, et cetera, because to create a net new plant is just so darn expensive and so darn hard. And so now what you're left with is just disparate data. You've got many different sideload systems from many different vendors. And so what then many manufacturers would have to do then is do integrations. And so as soon as you even say that word, in many cases, people are like cringe, like, oh God, integration that, it's going to take a year and cost me $1 million and whatnot. And so a lot of custom things, a lot of data hubs, a lot of data warehouses, et cetera. But unfortunately, in many cases, the data is stale. It's old. It's not even the latest, greatest, or the applications still keep getting upgraded, and then the integration falls apart. And so again, you think about these poor folks out there in the world trying to do this stuff with just, old tools, old software, old data, and trying to just do the best they can. In many cases, just gut, like, hey, we think that this is going to be something we have to do or something we have to do. And so, that's a shame. And so it's not a real pretty picture out there in many cases. I've heard many nightmare stories about manufacturing, and you just sort of figure it out.
Can you share some of those stories or one of those stories?
Yeah, I heard a story recently I was talking to someone about their manufacturing capabilities for a very sort of, I won't go into great detail, but, pretty complicated product. And they were telling me that they have to produce a couple pieces of the product in a very specialized plant in Europe. And this particular product has to be kept refrigerated. So they'll build up a couple of the pieces, if you will. I'm not trying to give too many details here. And then ship it cold back to the United States to a manufacturing plant that then completes some additional manufacturing steps and fill and finish there. And then ships it cold back to Europe so that it can then be doing some additional pieces to it and then ship it out globally from there. That's today. That's not like,
that wasn't 20 years ago. Yeah.
This was recent. And so that just goes to show that they don't have the capabilities. And no, look, full disclosure, this is not a big giant company, but just goes to show that even in today's, pretty cutting edge world, that we still got lots of legacy stuff.
Yeah. And I would imagine that that's a common scenario for a lot of companies.
Yeah.
Just given what has been in the past and what we're working with today and the expense that's involved, like you said, I mean, billions of dollars to create a new manufacturing facility. Well, who can do that? And figuring out.
Look, that's interesting. That's given rise to a lot of contract manufacturing, which is a sort of bustling, nice big industry. But then you lose some control over certain things. I'm not saying that contract manufacturing is bad. It definitely serves a need for certain things. But in many cases, manufacturers want to be in control more and or distribute faster or do some interesting things, et cetera. So look, again, this is it's all opportunity. It's just for a million different reasons. Manufacturing has sort of been the one left out, if you will. Clinical and regulatory have sort of enjoyed a lot more innovation, and manufacturing has sort of been left behind a little bit. So it's an interesting area for sure.
Yeah. And something you mentioned too is as this data is getting integrated, and it's a timestamp, right? It's not necessarily real-time data. It's at the moment. But as we're getting more AI technologies that are being incorporated into the space, what does this look like? Is there going to be that ability for that real-time data to make real-time decisions? How can this be realized in the manufacturing setting?
Yeah, no. So, AI is obviously all the buzz and all the rage. It probably can't go even a day without seeing or hearing about it. But first off, quick plug: if you're not playing with AI every single day on your own, you're missing out. These are new tools that we should all be leveraging. This is just like the internet. This is not something to be scared of or worried about, et cetera. And contrary to probably most headlines today, it's not taking everybody's job and sort of taking over the world just yet. This is an inflection. This is an inflection point, and those are cool. In this case, I've sort of lived through, let's say, maybe 2 or 3 of these now. and it's going to fundamentally change everything. Unfortunately, this is being painted in some cases as maybe a little scary, et cetera. And so some people may be shying away from it, or, in a highly regulated space like pharma, life sciences, people are just very cautious about this, which is understandable. Again, I don't want to take a medication that had an algorithm make a decision about something that was wrong, perhaps for whatever reason. But this represents a big opportunity. And from my perspective, why it represents such a big opportunity is because there are certain things today that AI is very, very good at. I completely understand and appreciate certain of the hallucinations and other things that people have probably seen, or it can't do simple math just yet, et cetera. But in this case, what we're just talking about is gigantic data sets, huge amounts of data being produced from many, many, many different systems globally at scale. And so when you get that much data and you don't have a really good place to look at it all or analyze it all, that creates lots of challenges. Humans could go and play and sort and filter and run queries on the data and look for certain things. And I'm sure that has served well. But we're at a place now where these tools are available. And so you'd be sort of silly not to use them. And so as long as it's constrained to something very specific, and in this case, maybe just saying, hey, look at this big giant set of data across 10 different systems and look for a pattern, look for a red flag, look for something like that. To me, that is just makes sense. And unfortunately, or good, bad, or otherwise, we live in a very competitive, complex world. And so I can guarantee that most are looking at this now and playing around with it, but they're trying to figure out, what's the right or wrong way to do it, and or making sure it's not making decisions that a human is not going to, continue to reinforce, et cetera. But these tools are very, very, very powerful. Again, I'm trying to use it literally every single day for something. Just test it, play with it. Don't think of this as someone like taking over the task, perhaps, but as an assistant to you, sort of like a friend or a colleague or someone that's there to sort of help mentor you or guide you or say, hey, look here, et cetera. So again, while change is hard, and I appreciate if you've been in some of these spaces for a long, long time, you sort of want to not necessarily move forward with these things. But honestly, I think you're silly if you're not at least exploring the use of some of this stuff today.
Well, and you can see the practical application of this, right? You just talked about how human beings are looking at this data, trying to find correlations, which takes a lot of time. And let's say you have an AI co-pilot that can just help and assist, right? Like, what you're looking for. So you're feeding it that information. So again, you have to be knowledgeable enough to be able to do that. But then it's assisting you in finding those correlations so that you're not spending days, weeks, months connecting all of that data.
Well, maybe we're even missing something, to be quite honest with you.
Yes.
I think a lot about pattern recognition. I think a lot about trying to identify red flags. But again, human is probably smart enough to know how to sort and filter certain things. I know I love playing with data myself and looking for things, but I can't always find everything. And so what you could see, though, is that in these very, very complicated products that we're looking to get, the yield that we're trying to achieve is still a challenge. We're still not seeing 100% yields across a lot of things. And going back to that very initial example that I was giving, where a whole manufacturing plant might work all day long to get a liter, even just getting 5% or 10% better at the end of the day makes a huge, huge difference. And so in this case, I start thinking about, baking. It's sort of funny sort of analogy to use here. I don't mean to minimize anything around manufacturing, but again, I'm not a baker, but I'm told that if you measure the ingredients by volume versus weight, that you get a pretty different, outcome. And so in this case, if we're able to, serve up the recipe and doing it in a way that we're taking all the input and all the issues and challenges that were identified by AI, or algorithms, et cetera, to identify where challenges have been in the process steps, and can be very, very conscious of that, then I think that can have a huge, huge difference. And the unlock is going to be a huge amount of value. You're able to produce more, maybe even faster, perhaps, look to streamline certain steps, or make better decisions, to be quite honest. I think that's what we really want. We don't want necessarily more choice. We want less choice. We want to be able to say, hey, what's the right thing to do here? I imagine in some of these cases, there's probably many different decisions that you could make. And so again, in this very, very complex competitive world, being able to produce even a little bit more from your manufacturing is going to unlock a tremendous amount of value. And so again, it should be something that all folks in manufacturing are really thinking about today.
And this is where Katalyze comes in to play, correct?
Exactly.
This is what they're doing.
Yeah, pretty wild. And again, we're not, I'm not here to sort of say like, I've used this myself, et cetera, but I've seen a lot of what it can do, bring all the data together in one place, and really help to identify and be that co-pilot to you to say, hey, if you want to look to maximize your yield, these are the things that you need to do. Now, each of these individual things might even be very complicated on their own. And what you'd be able to do then is prioritize them. They sort of say maybe you could do 1 or 2 or 3 big things in a year. But if you're not focused on the right things and or in the most value, this will give you the data to be able to say, hey, if you were going to do one thing, this would be the area in the manufacturing process where you should focus, where you should really look to maximize. And so that's powerful. I think in many cases, people are sort of begging for these kind of tools, and for a million different reasons, just maybe not able to sort of pivot quickly enough or explore these things. But again, I would implore you to be playing with AI all the time, and or looking for solutions like this to help you out, because this is clearly the next wave.
Yeah. And of all things, Mike, you talked about how there's some fear, and obviously there's regulation in this space, but yield optimization seems like a good place to begin.
No, that's actually a great point. You would sort of say, look, there's probably millions of different use cases here. I'm sure that all kinds of people are thinking about all these things that can be sort of done with these kind of technologies, automation wise. You're absolutely right. I think I'm not going to say that's the exact always first place to start, but it seems to me when it's a straight up data play like this is, and identifying and starting out, it would clearly be somewhere that would be straightforward, and could produce a pretty dramatic effect. It would seem like certainly one of the early use cases to be exploring, especially as we continue to learn more and more about this stuff. The other crazy thing that we haven't really touched on is that the rate of innovation here now too has been just astounding. Again, when these early models came out, maybe 2 years ago or so, there was clearly gaps, but now there's been new models introduced even in the last month or so that are now able to do all kinds of things where they're teaching it and making it better and better and better. The amount of resources and people that are focused on making these AI products better and better is just amazing. And so I even sometimes struggle to keep up with it. I feel like I read the news every single day about this stuff. I love it because I think it's really cool. And every day I'm learning about some other new piece of it. So yeah, look, this stuff's really cool. And it's definitely something that people should be looking at.
Yeah. And you're in a very unique position too, because you're advising a lot of different organizations. So you get to see the development faster than anyone else in the industry.
Yeah, I am. I've sort of been advising a bunch of sort of AI startups.
Yeah.
And well, amazing just to see all the new companies that are being created as a result of this. And that's how you could also sort of feel like this is a major transition when folks are now putting money and time behind these things. It's wild. Things that weren't even like conceivable even a few years ago. And so, yeah, I am seeing a lot of different cool AI startups for sure. And yeah, I could definitely tell you that this is of the ones that I'm sort of been aware of, et cetera. This is one that is certainly one of the most exciting that I've seen for sure, because again, it's so clear and straightforward. And again, from a value perspective, tremendous.
Yeah. Talking about Katalyze.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been great, Mike. Thank you so much for
sure.
sharing your knowledge, your expertise. I guess if you were to leave this conversation, leave the listeners with a piece of advice. I mean, you've given this already, but everyone should be playing around with AI. But in the industry, what do you recommend that people do pay attention to? Any piece of knowledge that you'd like to drop or advice you'd like to share?
Yeah, the first one would have been just play, right?
Yeah.
You can't mess anything up here. And don't think about asking big giant questions of it when you use these sort of, ChatGPT or other models. Dig deeper, have a conversation with it. So you could certainly say, hey, write me an essay, whatever. But then when it gives back, it's like, why did you do it this way? Or tell me one thing that I missed that we should have been talking about. Dig deeper into it, play with it, have a conversation with it. And I think you'll be astounded at the level that it's at today. And then the second thing is, if you're an organization out there sort of thinking about this, I'm sure I'm hearing about many that are having like a AI committee or some kind of a board that's looking at a lot of these things. You got to start with something. Just start with some simple use case to start getting familiar with it, seeing how it's looking, et cetera. Certainly pay attention to what the regulators are saying. So look for the lowest risk type of use case, but I think you got to just start with something. And then just take one step. And I think you'll be amazed at the amount of value that these new tools can bring.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Mike. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.